The differences between the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod. This is something that I've been asked about a lot, and I addressed it in a podcast quite a few years ago now, so it's been a while since I've discussed it. And on that podcast, I dealt with, I think the title of it was Alphabet Soup, dealing with the different Lutheran denominations and their differences. So you can just Google that and find that if you want to learn a little more about this. But the basic differences between WELS and the LCMS in terms of church fellowship, that's really going to be the major area of difference. So for those who aren't as familiar with what these groups are, the Wisconsin Synod and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod are both confessional Lutheran church bodies. They hold to a full subscription to our Lutheran confessional documents in the Book of Concord. And for many years, the two were in fellowship, meaning that they had altar pulpit fellowship, so they could commune at each other's altars. They could, a pastor from one could preach in the other. The denomination I'm a part of, or the synod I'm a part of, is the Association of American Lutheran Churches. We're in full altar pulpit fellowship with the Missouri Synod, but not with the Wisconsin Synod. So the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod were both part of what was called the Synodical Conference, which was really the most strict group of confessional Lutherans in America in the 19th into the 20th centuries. So there was a lot of dialogue, discussion between the two. They cooperated together very well. So at some point, they ended up drifting apart. Now, part of the reason for that was that the Missouri Synod started veering leftward theologically in some ways, and there were views in the seminary that were being taught that were farther left in terms of their views of the authority of Scripture, and other important issues like women's ordination. And while that was happening, the Missouri Synod declared a fellowship with the ALC, which is actually where I come from, where the ALC comes from. But the ALC itself had kind of gone in more in that direction as well at that point. So this caused the Wisconsin Synod eventually to break fellowship with the Missouri Synod, because the Missouri Synod had declared fellowship with a church body that had some views that were not great, which led to the AALC being formed from the ALC because of some of the drifting of certain theological positions there in the mid-20th century. So they ended up splitting. Now, what happened in the Missouri Synod is then that we had SEMX, which is a whole other kind of big story. You can find plenty of resources about that. But there was a division within the seminary at St. Louis. There was an investigative team that went to figure out what was being taught. Essentially, those more left-leaning professors left. They formed their own seminary called SEMX, meaning Seminary in Exile, and then the more confessional professors stayed on. And so the whole church body went then in a more confessional direction, just as it had been previously. So it moved back to kind of where it had been before. So because of that, you might expect then, well, the Missouri Synod fixed the differences with the Wisconsin Synod, so maybe now they can come back into fellowship at that point. As of yet, that has not happened. So they've now still remained very much separate. The Wisconsin Synod does not have fellowship with the Missouri Synod or the AALC or other church bodies that are in fellowship with those, Lutheran Church Canada and some others. So now, there are some theological differences that have shown themselves since that the two broke fellowship. There are numerous ones. One is in terms of ordination. There's a little bit of a different view. The Wisconsin Synod tends to have a more kind of functionalist view of what makes one a pastor, and of ordination, which would really lead to a whole other theological discussion, which I know a lot of people are asking me about, so I'll do something on ordination in the future. But probably the most significant difference, and the one that is discussed the most often, is in terms of views of church fellowship. So the question has to do with what does it mean to fellowship with those with whom we are not in doctrinal agreement, who are Christians? To what extent can we have fellowship with those who are Christians but are not, we don't believe have correct theology on certain areas, even some pretty significant areas? So there are different ways of approaching this. And what happened in Lutheranism when you had basically a more open view of non-Lutherans coming into the pulpit and preaching in Lutheran congregations, or kind of a mixing of Lutheran Reformed. What ended up happening in pretty much every circumstance, is that Lutheranism itself ended up being lost. and the Lutheran views of the sacraments disappeared, and the Lutheran congregations basically became just Reformed, or some brand of Protestant influenced by the Reformed. So huge problem, very significant problem. So wisely, Lutherans in the 19th century coming to America and seeing the issues in some Lutheran congregations where their pastors were, going to Princeton Seminary, getting trained by Reformed people, and then abandoning Lutheran views of the sacraments, their whole Lutheran identity was lost. So the people in Synodical Conference said, look, we Lutheran pulpits for Lutheran pastors only. We don't want these other doctrines being taught. We want to retain our confessional identity. It's very, very important that it's not lost, especially, in America where, at the time it was, and it still is really, depending on where you are in America, but it's very much influenced by the Reformed churches rather than Lutheran in a broad sense. So because of that, fellowship was a major issue. Now, since that time, there have been a lot of discussions about what extent we can have Christian fellowship with Christians who disagree with us. And there are different positions, there are different opinions about exactly how that works. So in the more strict forms, which would be in the Wisconsin Synod or the ELS, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, they would say that essentially there's no difference between prayer fellowship and other kinds of Christian fellowship and communion fellowship, or coming to the altar, or altar and pulpit fellowship. And so in the Wisconsin Synod, there's a very strict view in terms of who is to pray with who. And so it's the belief of the Wisconsin Synod that someone who is a member of the Wisconsin Synod should not pray with Christians who have other views. In other words, there is no form of fellowship that they should be engaged in with those who they are not officially in doctrinal fellowship or doctrinal agreement with. So there really is no form of Christian fellowship or engagement at all outside of those who are in fellowship with them. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have theological discussions with people. It doesn't mean they think that no one is saved outside of the Wisconsin Synod by any means. But something like the work that I'm doing here on campus at Cornell would be something that I wouldn't be allowed to do if I was in the Wisconsin Synod, because I do work with other Christians who do have a high view of Scripture and believe in the life and teachings of Jesus, the literal resurrection, the miracles of Jesus. Those who have very basic evangelical, broadly speaking, commitments. I would not be able to do the things that I do in terms of prayer and working with those people from a Wisconsin Synod perspective. So the other perspective, which is where the Missouri Synod and the AALC, which is what I'm a part of, coming from. There is a distinction between Christian fellowship and then altar and pulpit fellowship. And so we would say that there's a difference between working together with other Christians on various things and meeting and praying with other Christians, and then sharing the divine service with them, where we're having people of other confessions speaking in our pulpits and people of other confessions coming to the Lord's table where they don't even agree with what we teach about the sacrament. Huge problem, I think. So that's really the main difference is can we distinguish between different kinds of Christian fellowship? Is there a distinction between altar and pulpit fellowship and then just fellowship in terms of prayer with other Christians? And I would say certainly there is a difference between the two. Coming to the sacrament, preaching in a pulpit are very different things than simply praying with a Christian who is a fellow believer but has different theological views. So that's the primary difference. There's a brief explanation. I'm not going to kind of give an in-depth defense here, but just for broader understanding of where the differences are, that's where they are.